In the blazing heat of Nellis Desert Training Facility, a graying fighter pilot was about to face the ultimate test of her career. What started as a routine training exercise took a shocking turn when multiple F-16s came face to face with catastrophic system failures in deadly weather. Major Evelyn Carter wasn't your typical squadron member facing retirement. For over 2 decades, she had spent her life mastering the art of fighter aviation, known for her meticulous preparation and unshakable calm under pressure. When she encountered simultaneous navigation and flight control failures across 4 aircraft during a severe desert storm, she had no idea she was walking into the moment that would define her legacy. Carter made split-second decisions using forgotten manual flying techniques that would lead to a complete transformation of military aviation training. What began as mockery from younger pilots who called her too old and too slow would become vindication of experience over arrogance. The entire Air Force would never be the same after discovering that the pilot they'd written off as obsolete possessed the only skills capable of bringing everyone home alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada sun crested the eastern mountains like a brass coin dropped into molten copper, sending long shadows across the tarmac of Nellis Desert Training Facility. By 0500 hours, the temperature had already climbed past 70 degrees, promising another day when the concrete would shimmer like water and the metal of the aircraft would become too hot to touch with bare hands. Major Evelyn Carter stepped out of the operations building, her flight suit crisp despite the early hour, her graying hair pulled back in the same precise bun she'd worn for the past 15 years. At 52, she moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion was wasted energy, and in the cockpit of an F-16, wasted energy could mean wasted lives. She carried her helmet bag in her left hand, her flight checklist folded neatly in her breast pocket, and approached her assigned aircraft, tail number 87-0257, with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. While other pilots named their jets with painted nose art and flashy call signs, Evelyn's plane bore only its regulation numbers and the faded outline where someone else's artwork had been painted over years ago. "Morning, Major." Sergeant Luis Ortega emerged from beneath the aircraft's belly, grease-stained hands wiping clean on a red shop rag. He was a compact man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing and the kind of weathered face that spoke of 2 decades spent under desert suns and hangar lights. "Morning, Sergeant. How's she looking today?" Evelyn set down her gear and began her walk-around inspection, running her fingers along the leading edge of the wing with practiced precision. "Clean as a whistle, ma'am. Replaced the number 2 generator last night. Had a minor fluctuation in the voltage regulator. Nothing dangerous, but you know how I feel about nothing dangerous." Evelyn nodded, appreciating his attention to detail. Ortega had been maintaining aircraft longer than some of the pilots had been alive, and his standards were even higher than hers. "And any word on the telemetry calibration issue from last week?" Ortega's expression darkened slightly. "Mentioned it to Lieutenant Morrison in maintenance control. He said the readings were within acceptable parameters." The way he pronounced the phrase suggested exactly what he thought of those parameters. "I see." Evelyn continued her inspection, checking the missile rails, the landing gear, the air intake. Everything looked perfect, but she'd learned long ago that looking perfect and being perfect were 2 very different things. "Well, we'll keep an eye on it." "Yes, ma'am. Always do." As Evelyn completed her external inspection, the sound of laughter and raised voices carried across the flight line. A group of younger pilots approached their aircraft in a loose formation, moving with the easy confidence of people who had never seriously contemplated their own mortality. Captain Jake Mercer led the group, his flight suit unzipped at the collar despite regulations, his helmet bag slung casually over one shoulder. At 28, he had the kind of natural charisma that junior officers wanted to follow and senior officers wanted to remember their own youth. His dark hair was perfectly styled beneath his flight cap, and his smile carried the assumption that everyone around him was pleased to be in his presence. "Looks like Granny Carter's doing her archaeology lesson again, taking samples of the aircraft to study back in the lab." Lieutenant Sarah Kim laughed along with the others, though Evelyn noticed the sound seemed forced. She was 24, a recent graduate of pilot training, with the kind of eager perfectionism that Evelyn reminded herself of at that age. She was caught between her desire to fit in with the established hierarchy and her natural respect for professionalism.
"Maybe she's looking for spare parts for the museum," added Lieutenant Brad Foster, another of Mercer's followers. "I hear they're building an exhibit on flying in the Stone Age." The group erupted in laughter, and Evelyn felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being the object of ridicule. She'd endured it for months now, ever since Colonel Hayes had made it clear that her retirement timeline was under discussion, and that younger pilots were the future of air superiority. She didn't look up from her inspection, but Ortega caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't let them see it bothers you," his expression said. She gave him the slightest nod in return. "You know what I heard?" Mercer continued, settling into his routine now that he had an audience. "I heard that back in her day, they had to use actual maps, like paper maps, with lines drawn on them." "No way," Foster replied, playing his part in the performance. "That's like actual navigation, using your brain and stuff." "Terrifying concept," Sarah added, quietly, though Evelyn could hear the discomfort in her voice. Evelyn completed her walk-around and began entering data into her flight log. Every check mark, every notation was precise and deliberate. She'd learned early in her career that documentation saved lives, and the habit had become as natural as breathing. Colonel Robert Hayes emerged from the operations building, his uniform immaculate, his bearing suggesting a man who had learned to command through careful observation of what commanded respect. He was 10 years younger than Evelyn, but had been promoted past her twice, a fact that neither of them ever mentioned, but both always remembered. "Gentlemen," he nodded to Mercer's group, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Major Carter." "Colonel." Evelyn's response was professionally neutral. Hayes consulted his tablet, scrolling through what Evelyn assumed was the day's training schedule. "Today's exercise focuses on close air support coordination. We'll be working with ground controllers on target designation and time on target calculations." He looked up, his gaze settling on Evelyn for a moment longer than necessary. "Remember, we're being evaluated on efficiency and modernization of our procedures. The Air Force is moving toward faster, more aggressive tactics." The message was clear: keep up or get out. "Roger that, sir," Mercer responded with enthusiasm. "We'll show them what real pilots can do when they're not held back by outdated procedures." Sarah shifted uncomfortably at the obvious dig, and Evelyn saw Ortega's jaw tighten slightly. But Hayes either didn't notice the comment or chose to ignore it. "Briefing in 20 minutes, the colonel announced. "Weather looks clear, but we've got winds gusting to 25 knots from the southwest. Plan accordingly." As Hayes walked away, Mercer turned back to his group, his voice carrying that particular edge that came with an audience and an absent authority figure. 25-knot winds, he said, shaking his head with exaggerated concern. "Hope Granny's got her reading glasses. Wouldn't want her to confuse the wind direction with her arthritis medicine instructions." The laughter that followed was cruel enough that even Foster looked slightly uncomfortable. Sarah turned away, busying herself with her own pre-flight checklist. Evelyn finished her exterior inspection and climbed the ladder to her cockpit. As she settled into the ejection seat and began connecting her various cables and hoses, she caught sight of Ortega watching her from the ground. He raised his hand in a small salute, not regulation but respectful, and she nodded back. Around her, the flight line came alive with the sounds of preparation, the whine of ground power units, the chatter of radio checks, the steady rhythm of a military operation preparing to execute its mission. It was a symphony she'd been listening to for over 2 decades, and despite everything, the mockery, The dismissal, the constant suggestion that she was past her usefulness, it still stirred something deep in her chest.
She had earned her place here in ways that most of the younger pilots couldn't imagine. She had flown missions when the consequences of failure meant more than a poor evaluation report. She had lost friends whose names were engraved on memorial walls, and she had learned that the difference between coming home and not coming home often came down to the kind of attention to detail that her younger colleagues dismissed as paranoia. But as she ran through her interior checklist, testing switches and verifying readings, Evelyn allowed herself a small, private smile. Let them laugh. Let them assume her careful preparation was a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. She had been underestimated before, and it had always been a more powerful advantage than they realized. The desert sun climbed higher, turning the world beyond the canopy into a shimmering promise of heat and challenge. In a few hours, they would all be airborne, and in the air, reputation mattered less than reality. And Evelyn Carter had always been very good with reality. The briefing room smelled of industrial coffee and the peculiar mix of cleaning chemicals and testosterone that seemed to permeate every military building Evelyn had ever entered. She sat in the third row, notebook open, pen ready, while around her the younger pilots treated the session like an extension of their earlier conversation. Major Rick Stanton, the operations officer, stood at the front with a pointer and a projection screen showing the day's training area. Today's scenario simulates close air support for troops in contact. You'll be working with ground controllers to engage multiple target sets while maintaining deconfliction with friendly forces. Evelyn took notes in her precise handwriting, recording wind conditions, frequencies, and coordination procedures. Around her, she could hear the scratch of pens on paper, but also the rustle of someone probably texting on their phone and the barely audible whisper of a side conversation. Time hack will be critical, Stanton continued. Ground teams will be marking targets with smoke, and you'll have narrow windows for engagement. Miss your timing, and you'll be Winchester while the ground guys are still taking fire. Jake Mercer raised his hand. Sir, what's the expected engagement sequence? Are we talking multiple passes or single-run targets? Good question. Mix of both. Some targets will require reattack, others need to be serviced on the first pass. You'll need to adapt quickly. Evelyn made a note about ammunition planning. In her experience, young pilots tended to expend ordnance too quickly, leaving themselves without options if the tactical situation changed. She'd learned to plan for the unexpected, to hold something in reserve for the moment when the careful briefing met the chaos of actual operations. Major Carter, Stanton's voice cut through her thoughts. Any questions about the coordination procedures? The question was delivered neutrally, but Evelyn caught the subtle implication the older pilot might need extra explanation. Around her, she felt the attention of the room focusing on her, waiting for her to reveal some confusion or outdated thinking. No question, sir. Standard CAS procedures, coordinated through the JTAC on primary frequency. Roger. Stanton moved on quickly, but not before Evelyn caught Jake's smirk and the way he leaned over to whisper something to Foster that made the younger man suppress a laugh. 20 minutes later, they were walking toward their aircraft, the Nevada sun now high enough to make the tarmac radiate heat like an oven. Evelyn moved with her usual measured pace, mentally reviewing the briefing while the others chatted about weekend plans and whose turn it was to buy drinks at the O Club. Hey, Evelyn, Sarah Kim fell into step beside her, her voice carefully casual. Mind if I ask you something? Go ahead, Lieutenant. That coordination timeline we briefed, have you run that type of scenario before? Evelyn glanced at the younger woman, noting the genuine curiosity in her question. A few times, in training, and she paused, then decided on honesty. And for real. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. For real? Iraq, 91. Different war, same principle. When troops are depending on you to put ordnance on target, timing becomes everything. What was that like? Evelyn considered how to answer. How could she explain the weight of real voices on the radio, reporting casualties, requesting immediate support? How could she describe the feeling of knowing that her accuracy might determine whether someone's father came home? Intense, she said finally. Very different from training. Before Sarah could respond, Jake's voice carried across the flight line. Time to show these targets what modern air power looks like. He was standing beside his aircraft, arms spread wide in a gesture that encompassed both his plane and his obvious enthusiasm for the coming mission.
"Think old school can keep up today, Evelyn?" he called out, his tone just friendly enough to provide plausible deniability if anyone questioned the comment later. "I'll do my best, Captain," Evelyn replied evenly, not breaking stride. "Hey, no shame in playing it safe," Jake continued. "Slow and steady, right? That's probably the smart move for someone with your, experience level." The words experience level carried just enough emphasis to make clear he wasn't referring to her expertise. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Evelyn simply nodded and continued toward her aircraft, where Ortega was waiting with a final status report. "All systems green, Major. Fuel loads complete. Weapon systems checked out clean." "Thank you, Sergeant." She began her external inspection again, even though she'd completed one just hours earlier. It was a habit that had saved her life more than once, and habits like that didn't change just because someone thought they were excessive. As she worked, she could hear Jake conducting his own pre-flight, or rather, his version of a pre-flight, which seemed to consist mainly of a quick walk around the aircraft while telling stories to whoever was listening. "So there I was, last month at Red Flag, right? Banded on my 6, and I pulled this vertical reversal that had to be seen to believed. AWACS is calling it one of the prettiest defensive maneuvers they'd recorded all week." Evelyn checked her missile seeker heads, verified her chaff and flare dispensers, and tested her landing gear. She'd heard Jake tell that Red Flag story before, and each time it got a little more dramatic, the bandit got a little closer, and Jake's maneuver got a little more impossible. "The thing about modern air combat," Jake continued, his voice carrying easily across the flight line, "is that it's all about speed and aggression. Hesitate for even a second and you're done. That's why you need pilots who can think fast and act faster." Evelyn finished her inspection and climbed into her cockpit. As she strapped in and began her interior checklist, she noticed Sarah doing the same in the aircraft next to hers. The young woman was thorough, Evelyn observed, with approval. She checked every switch, tested every system, and took notes in her kneeboard. The radio crackled to life as the flight prepared to taxi. "Viper flight, ground control, taxi to runway 27 for departure." Jake's voice came back immediately. "Viper 1, roger, taxi to 27. Let's go hunting, gentlemen." As they taxied out in formation, Evelyn found herself thinking about the difference between confidence and competence. Jake had confidence in abundance, the kind that came from natural talent and consistent success in controlled environments. But competence was something different. Competence was built through experience, through mistakes survived and lessons learned the hard way. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Evelyn watched Jake's aircraft accelerate down the runway with what seemed like unnecessary drama, pulling into a steep climb that looked impressive but wasted energy and fuel. She took off smoothly, efficiently, her climb gradient calculated to reach their assigned altitude with minimum stress on the aircraft and maximum conservation of resources. In the air, the difference in their styles became even more apparent. Jake flew like he was performing for an audience, with aggressive turns, dramatic altitude changes, and radio calls that bordered on the theatrical. "Viper 1, tally multiple targets, request clearance to engage. This is gonna be beautiful." Evelyn flew like she was doing a job, professionally, precisely, with constant attention to fuel state, aircraft position, and the location of every other player in the scenario. When she spotted her assigned target, she didn't announce it with fanfare. She simply keyed her radio and said, "Viper 4, target acquired, requesting clearance hot." "Viper 4, you're cleared hot." Evelyn rolled into her attack run with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times.
She had calculated her approach angle, planned her egress route, and allowed for wind correction before she'd even started her descent. Her weapons release was textbook perfect, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because textbook perfect was how you ensured the ordnance went exactly where it was supposed to go. Viper 4, good hit, target destroyed. Jake, meanwhile, had turned his attack run into an aerobatic display, rolling inverted before his dive, pulling more Gs than necessary in his recovery, and generally treating the exercise like his personal air show. Viper 1, splash 1 target, how's that for air-to-ground precision? As they regrouped for the next target set, Evelyn caught a transmission from Sarah. Viper 3 requesting tactical frequency for coordination. It was a smart request. Sarah was trying to get better situational awareness of the overall scenario, instead of just focusing on her individual targets. Evelyn made a mental note of the young pilot's tactical thinking.
The exercise continued for another 40 minutes, with multiple target sets and increasingly complex coordination requirements. Evelyn flew each attack run with the same methodical precision, never wasting ammunition, never exceeding aircraft limitations, always planning 3 moves ahead. Jake's style remained consistently aggressive and showy, but Evelyn noticed that his fuel consumption was higher than optimal, and his ammunition expenditure rate suggested he might run out of ordnance before the scenario was complete. When they finally headed back to base, Evelyn's aircraft was still carrying 20% of its fuel load and had ordnance remaining for contingency targets. Jake was already calling Winchester, out of ammunition, and requesting priority recovery due to fuel state. As they entered the landing pattern, Evelyn heard Jake keying the radio again. Tower, Viper 1, demonstrating how it's done for the rookie pilots. His landing was admittedly impressive, a high-speed approach with a dramatic flare that put the aircraft down exactly on the markers. It was the kind of landing that looked great from the ground and required genuine skill to execute. Evelyn's landing was different. Smooth, controlled, precisely on speed and on glide path, with minimal wear on the tires and brakes. It wasn't dramatic, but it was exactly the kind of landing that aircraft maintenance crews appreciated, and that allowed for maximum aircraft availability. As she taxied back to the parking area, Evelyn could already hear Jake's voice on the ground frequency, providing his own commentary on the mission. Not bad for a morning's work. Some pretty impressive flying out there, if I do say so myself. She shut down her engines and began her post-flight checklist, noting fuel remaining, any maintenance discrepancies, and mission effectiveness. It was methodical work, the kind of attention to detail that ensured the aircraft would be ready for the next mission and that any lessons learned would be properly documented. But as she climbed down from the cockpit, she could already see the group gathering around Jake's aircraft, eager to hear his version of the morning's events. And she knew that his version would be the one everyone remembered, regardless of what the actual mission data might show. The Officers' Club at Nellis had the weary atmosphere of a place that had seen too many celebration drinks and too many farewell parties. The walls were covered with Squadron patches, photographs of aircraft, and plaques commemorating events that seemed increasingly distant in an Air Force that was changing faster than anyone could quite keep up with. Evelyn sat at a corner table with a club sandwich and a Diet Coke, reviewing her mission notes from the afternoon's training. She had developed the habit years ago of conducting her own post-flight analysis, looking for ways to improve efficiency, identify potential safety issues, and plan for contingencies that might arise in future scenarios. The afternoon mission had gone well, at least by her standards. All targets had been successfully engaged, no safety violations had occurred, and her aircraft had returned with fuel and ammunition to spare. But she knew that her performance would be measured by different criteria that valued style over substance and excitement over effectiveness. At the bar, Jake Mercer was holding court with his usual audience, gesturing with a beer in one hand while he recreated the day's flying with the other. His voice carried clearly across the room, as it was designed to do. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. So I'm coming in on this target, right? Ground controllers getting anxious because the simulated friendlies are supposedly taking fire. I drop down to about 50 feet, and I mean 50 feet, none of this safe altitude nonsense, and I put that GPU right through the front door. Lieutenant Foster, ever the faithful wingman, provided the appropriate response. How close were you to terrain? Close enough to read the license plates on the ground vehicles. That's what modern air power is all about. precision, aggression, and the willingness to take calculated risks. The implication was clear enough that even Foster looked slightly uncomfortable. But Jake wasn't finished. The thing is, though, modern warfare doesn't reward caution. The enemy doesn't care if you've been flying for 20 years if you can't adapt to current tactics. Experience is great, but experience with outdated procedures is just, well, it's outdated. Evelyn took a bite of her sandwich and continued reading her notes. She'd heard variations of this speech before, and she knew that responding would only provide Jake with more material for his performance. I mean, look at today's mission, Jake went on, warming to his theme. Some of us were out there showing what 21st century air power looks like, and others were flying like they were worried about getting a speeding ticket. This time the laughter was more forced, and Evelyn saw Sarah shift uncomfortably in her chair. "Captain Mercer," Sarah said quietly. "Major Carter did hit all her targets." "Oh, absolutely," Jake replied, his tone suggesting magnanimous agreement. "No question about that. Slow and steady wins the race, right? Very methodical, very careful." The way he pronounced careful made it sound like a character flaw. Lieutenant Foster, perhaps sensing that the conversation was becoming uncomfortable, tried to change the subject. "So, who's flying the night mission tomorrow?" "Actually," Jake said, clearly not ready to move on, "that brings up an interesting point. Night flying, low altitude, complex coordination requirements." He took a drink and let the implications settle. "You really need pilots who can think fast and adapt quickly. No time for extensive deliberation or excessive caution." Evelyn closed her notebook and looked up for the first time since Jake had started talking. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment the conversation stopped. "Something to add, Major?" Jake asked, his tone perfectly polite and completely challenging. "No, Captain. You seem to have covered everything. Just thinking out loud about crew assignments, making sure we put the right people in the right positions for mission success." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's always the goal." Jake's smile was sharp. "Exactly. Mission first, right? Even if that means making some difficult decisions about who's best suited for what types of missions." The room had gone quiet now, the other conversations dying away as people sensed the tension. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear, and even Foster seemed to realize that his squadron leader had crossed some invisible line. "Well," Evelyn said, standing and gathering her things, "I should get some rest. Early brief tomorrow." "Good idea. Beauty sleep is important at our age." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. It was just ambiguous enough to provide deniability. After all, Jake was only 38 himself, but specific enough to make his meaning clear. Evelyn paused at the edge of their table. "You know, Captain, you're absolutely right about one thing." "What's that?" "Experience with outdated procedures is just outdated." She met his eyes directly. "The trick is knowing which procedures are actually outdated and which ones just look outdated to people who've never needed them." She walked away before he could respond. But as she reached the door, she heard Foster's voice, carefully neutral. "What did she mean by that?" And Jake's response, trying to sound confident but not quite succeeding. "Who knows? Probably just more old-school philosophy." Outside the officers' club, the desert area was beginning to cool as the sun set behind the mountains. Evelyn walked slowly toward her quarters, thinking about the conversation she'd just left behind. She'd endured worse over the years, much worse. But tonight's performance had carried an edge of cruelty that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Behind her, she heard the club door open and close, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps on the gravel walkway. "Major Carter, ma'am?" Evelyn turned to see Sarah Kim jogging to catch up, her face flushed with embarrassment or anger or both. "Lieutenant?" "Ma'am, I just wanted to say—" Sarah struggled for the right words. "What Captain Mercer said in there, that wasn't—
I mean, your flying today was really impressive. Your target timing, your fuel management, I was watching your approach and it was textbook perfect. Evelyn studied the young woman's face in the fading light. Thank you, Lieutenant, but you don't need to. Yes, ma'am, I do, because what he's doing isn't right, and someone should say so. Lieutenant Kim, I appreciate your support, but Captain Mercer is your flight lead. You need to maintain good working relationships within the squadron. Even when he's wrong? The question hung between them like a challenge to everything Evelyn had learned about military hierarchy and unit cohesion. She thought about the young pilot standing in front of her, Sarah's eagerness to do the right thing, her obvious intelligence, and her willingness to speak up despite the potential consequences.
Lieutenant, Evelyn said finally, the best thing you can do is focus on becoming the best pilot you can be. Learn everything you can from everyone, even the people you disagree with. And remember that there's more than one way to be right. Sarah nodded, though she looked like she wanted to argue further. Yes, ma'am. I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with what's being said. I know, and that means more than you might realize. As Sarah walked back toward the club, Evelyn continued toward her quarters, thinking about the conversation and about the young pilot's obvious conflict between fitting in and standing up. It reminded her of her own early years, when she'd faced similar choices and made decisions that had shaped her entire career. The desert was settling into evening now, the temperature dropping and the first stars beginning to appear in the clear sky. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another opportunity for Jake to demonstrate his philosophy of modern air power, and another chance for the subtle erosion of respect that had been wearing away at her position for months. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt something like optimism. Not because anything had changed, but because someone had noticed. Someone had seen the difference between performance and competence, between style and substance. And in an Air Force that seemed increasingly focused on image over ability, that kind of recognition felt like a small victory worth savoring. The maintenance hangar at 0630 hours was a cathedral of aluminum and fluorescent light, filled with the constant hum of equipment and the echoing voices of technicians preparing aircraft for another day of operations. Evelyn stood beneath the belly of her F-16, studying the telemetry readout on Sergeant Ortega's diagnostic tablet with the focused attention of someone reading a medical chart. See this fluctuation pattern? It's subtle, but there's a timing delay in the navigation system's GPS correlation. Ortega frowned at the screen, his weathered fingers tracing the anomalous readings. Been seeing similar glitches across 3 different aircraft this week. Nothing that exceeds tolerances, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. But it's not right, ma'am. How long has this been developing? Started about 10 days ago. Real gradual-like. First aircraft showed it, another. Now we're up to 5 birds with similar symptoms. Ortega's voice carried the frustration of a professional who knew something was wrong but couldn't prove it within the rigid parameters of military regulations. Evelyn studied the data more closely. In her experience, gradual system degradations were often more dangerous than sudden failures because they crept past normal detection thresholds until they reached critical mass. What's maintenance control's position? Lieutenant Morrison says the readings fall within acceptable variance parameters. Technically, he's right. None of the individual readings exceed the threshold for a grounding. But collectively, ma'am, I'd say we're looking at a pattern that suggests something's affecting multiple aircraft systems. Could be environmental, could be a batch problem with a component, could be interference from some new equipment they've installed. He closed the tablet and looked directly at her. What I can tell you is that in 23 years of maintaining fighters, I've learned to trust patterns more than individual readings. Evelyn nodded slowly. She'd learned the same lesson about patterns, in weather, in enemy behavior, in mechanical systems, and in human nature. Patterns told stories that individual data points couldn't reveal. I'll take this to Colonel Hayes. Ma'am? Ortega hesitated. You might want to be prepared for some pushback. There's been talk about the training schedule, about maintaining mission tempo. Word is that anything that might delay operations is being scrutinized pretty carefully. 20 minutes later, Evelyn stood in attention in Colonel Hayes' office, watching him scroll through the maintenance data on his computer screen. The office was spartanly decorated. A few commendations on the wall, a photograph of Hayes with some Pentagon officials, and a small American flag in a desktop stand. Major Carter, I'm looking at these numbers, and I have to say, I'm not seeing the problem. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting a man who was being patient but had limited time for patience. Look, I understand you're concerned. That's commendable. But we have a training schedule to maintain, and these aircraft are needed for mission readiness. Sir, with respect, if there's an underlying systems issue, it will show up in the normal maintenance cycle. Until then, these aircraft are mission capable and we need them in the air. Hayes turned back to his computer, clearly considering the conversation finished. Is there anything else, Major? No, sir. As Evelyn left the colonel's office, she nearly collided with Jake Mercer in the hallway. He was carrying a flight bag and wearing the confident expression of someone heading out for what he expected to be an excellent day of flying. Morning, Evelyn. Heard you were in talking to the colonel about some maintenance concerns. His tone was carefully neutral, but there was something in his expression that suggested he'd heard more than just rumors. Just some telemetry irregularities, Captain? Ah, Jake nodded sagely. You know, I've been flying these birds for 8 years now, and one thing I've learned is that you can't let every little electronic hiccup make you paranoid. Modern aircraft are incredibly robust. They're designed to handle minor variances. Of course. I mean, if we grounded every aircraft that showed some minor telemetry fluctuation, we'd never get off the ground, right? He smiled, but there was an edge to it. Can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, especially when we've got training objectives to meet. Evelyn studied his face, wondering how much of his position was genuine belief and how much was simply reflexive opposition to anything she suggested. Well, Jake continued, I'm sure the colonel made the right call. He's got to balance safety with mission requirements, and that's not always an easy position. He paused, then added with what seemed like casual afterthought. Besides, some of us are more comfortable with a little uncertainty than others. Goes with the territory when you're pushing the envelope. The implication was clear. Her concerns were a sign of excessive caution, possibly even cowardice. The mission briefing room buzzed with anticipation as pilots filed in for what promised to be the most complex training exercise of the month. Large-scale close air support, multiple aircraft, coordination with ground controllers, and a scenario designed to test every aspect of their tactical proficiency. Major Stanton stood at the front of the room beside a detailed map of the training area. Gentlemen, ladies, today's exercise simulates a major ground offensive requiring sustained air support over a 6-hour window. 4 flights of fighters rotating through multiple target sets with real-time coordination requirements. Evelyn took her usual seat and opened her notebook, but she couldn't shake the nagging concern about the morning's conversation with Ortega. The telemetry issues might not exceed individual tolerances, but the idea of putting multiple aircraft with questionable systems into a complex, high-stress scenario felt like compounding risk unnecessarily. Weather briefing shows clear skies initially, but we've got a fast-moving front approaching from the northwest. Winds increasing to 35 knots, gusting to 50 by late afternoon with possible thunderstorm activity. Jake Mercer raised his hand. Sir, are we looking at weather delays or cancellation? Negative. Exercise begins as scheduled. We'll monitor conditions and adjust as necessary, but the scenario requires operation in marginal weather. Real combat doesn't wait for perfect conditions. Evelyn made a note about the weather timeline. In her experience, adjust as necessary often meant continuing until conditions became dangerous rather than planning for safe termination points. Major Stanton. Stanton's voice interrupted her thoughts. You'll be leading the second wave, coordinating with Flight Lead Mercer on target handoff procedures. The assignment placed her in a support role to Jake's primary leadership, an arrangement that was becoming increasingly common as the squadron prepared for her eventual retirement. After the briefing, pilots clustered around the weather station, studying satellite imagery and wind forecasts. The approaching front looked more aggressive than Stanton had suggested, with tight pressure gradients that promised severe turbulence and rapidly changing conditions. "Looks like we're going to get some weather after all," Sarah Kim observed, studying the radar loop on her phone. "Nothing we can't handle," Jake replied confidently. "Modern aircraft, modern navigation systems. As long as you trust your instruments and fly aggressively, weather is just another tactical consideration." Lieutenant Foster nodded agreement. "Besides, this is what we train for, right? Operating in challenging conditions, pushing the envelope." Evelyn watched the satellite loop again, noting the speed of the front's movement and the intensity of the precipitation course. "That's a fast-moving system. Conditions could deteriorate more quickly than forecasted." "There's that famous optimism again," Jake said with a laugh that was just friendly enough to avoid seeming openly hostile. "Come on, Evelyn. Where's your sense of adventure?" "I save my sense of adventure when the mission requires it. For training, I prefer predictable outcomes." "And that's exactly the difference between old-school and new-school flying," Jake replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone making an important point for the benefit of the younger pilots. "Modern air power is about adaptability, about being willing to operate in uncertain conditions and trust your training." As they walked toward their aircraft, Evelyn noticed Ortega waiting beside her plane with an expression that suggested news she didn't want to hear. "Major, I've got an update on those telemetry issues." "Go ahead, Sergeant." "Ran extensive diagnostics on all the affected aircraft. The pattern's getting more pronounced, and we've got 2 more birds showing similar symptoms." He handed her a data sheet. "Still within tolerances, but barely. And if conditions get rough today—" "Understood." Evelyn studied the numbers, confirming her earlier concerns. Systems that were marginal in perfect conditions could become unreliable when stressed by weather, high-G maneuvering, or complex tactical scenarios. "Ma'am, I took the liberty of mentioning this to Captain Mercer's crew chief, just so they'd be aware." "Good thinking. What was the response?" Ortega's expression darkened slightly. "He said that Captain Mercer doesn't worry about minor electronic issues, and that modern pilots know how to adapt to equipment variances." 20 minutes later, engines were spinning up across the flight line as the squadron prepared for launch. The weather was still clear, but Evelyn could see the dark line of clouds building on the northwestern horizon, moving faster than the forecast had predicted. She completed her pre-flight checks with extra attention to the navigation and flight control systems, noting several minor anomalies that individually meant nothing, but collectively suggested the pattern Ortega had identified was continuing to develop. "Viper Flight, ground control, taxi for departure." As they taxied toward the runway, Evelyn caught Jake's transmission. "Looking forward to showing everyone how it's done in challenging conditions. Time to separate the real pilots from the cautious ones." The comment was clearly meant for her, and equally clearly designed to establish the narrative for whatever happens next. Aggressive pilots who embraced challenge versus cautious pilots who worried about minor problems. But as they lined up for takeoff, Evelyn found herself thinking about the difference between confidence and recklessness, between trusting your equipment and ignoring warning signs. In her experience, the most dangerous moments came when those distinctions got blurred by ego and peer pressure. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and she watched Jake's aircraft accelerate down the runway with characteristic drama. As her own turn approached, she made a final check of her instruments, noting the subtle irregularities that everyone else had dismissed as acceptable variants. In a few hours, they would either complete a successful training mission or discover why experienced pilots learn to worry about patterns that others ignored. 40 minutes into the mission, the first signs of trouble appeared not as dramatic failure, but as the kind of subtle degradation that could easily be dismissed as normal variation. Evelyn's navigation display flickered briefly, showing her position as several hundred meters east of where her GPS indicated she should be. "Viper 4, checking navigation correlation," she transmitted, her voice professionally calm. "Roger, Viper 4, showing you on course from our perspective.
came the reply from the AWAS controller. But Evelyn had learned to trust her instincts more than convenient reassurances. She cross-checked her position using visual landmarks and magnetic compass bearing, confirming that her instruments were indeed providing conflicting information. Around her, the weather was beginning to deteriorate faster than forecast. The clear skies of an hour ago had given way to scattered clouds that were building into something more threatening. Wind gusts were increasing, and she could see the dark wall of the approaching front moving across the desert like a tsunami of bad weather. Viper lead, requesting weather update. Jake's response crackled through increasing static. Viper 4, weather is manageable. Maintain formation and continue mission. But manageable was clearly a relative term. The wind was now gusting to 40 knots, creating turbulence that made precise formation flying increasingly difficult. Evelyn noticed that her aircraft's response to control inputs was becoming sluggish, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the flight control systems were struggling to compensate for the atmospheric conditions. Viper flight, heads up. I'm showing intermittent navigation errors. Recommend cross-checking positions using backup systems. Viper 4, maintain position and stop cluttering the frequency with minor technical issues. We've got a mission to complete. Lieutenant Foster's voice joined the conversation. Viper 2, also showing some nav display fluctuation. All aircraft, trust your primary systems and maintain mission focus. Jake replied firmly. Minor electronic...
Ma'am, I took the liberty of mentioning this to Captain Mercer's crew chief, just so they'd be aware. Good thinking. What was the response? Ortega's expression darkened slightly. He said that Captain Mercer doesn't worry about minor electronic issues and that modern pilots know how to adapt to equipment variances. 20 minutes later, engines were spinning up across the flight line as the squadron prepared for launch. The weather was still clear, but Evelyn could see the dark line of clouds building on the northwestern horizon, moving faster than the forecast had predicted. She completed her pre-flight checks with extra attention to the navigation and flight control systems, noting several minor anomalies that individually meant nothing, but collectively suggested the pattern Ortega had identified was continuing to develop. Viper flight, ground control, taxi for departure. As they taxied toward the runway, Evelyn caught Jake's transmission. Looking forward to showing everyone how it's done in challenging conditions. Time to separate the real pilots from the cautious ones. The comment was clearly meant for her, and equally clearly designed to establish the narrative for whatever happened next. Aggressive pilots who embraced challenge versus cautious pilots who worried about minor problems. But as they lined up for takeoff, Evelyn found herself thinking about the difference between confidence and recklessness, between trusting your equipment and ignoring warning signs. In her experience, the most dangerous moments came when those distinctions got blurred by ego and peer pressure. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and she watched Jake's aircraft accelerate down the runway with characteristic drama. As her own turn approached, she made a final check of her instruments, noting the subtle irregularities that everyone else had dismissed as acceptable variants. In a few hours, they would either complete a successful training mission or discover why experienced pilots learned to worry about patterns that others ignored. 40 minutes into the mission, the first signs of trouble appeared not as dramatic failure, but as the kind of subtle degradation that could easily be dismissed as normal variation. Evelyn's navigation display flickered briefly, showing her position as several hundred meters east of where her GPS indicated she should be. Viper 4, checking navigation correlation, she transmitted, her voice professionally calm. Roger, Viper 4, showing you on course from our perspective, came the reply from the AWACS controller, but Evelyn had learned to trust her instincts more than convenient reassurances. She cross-checked her position using visual landmarks and magnetic compass bearing, confirming that her instruments were indeed providing conflicting information. Around her, the weather was beginning to deteriorate faster than forecast. The clear skies of an hour ago had given way to scattered clouds that were building into something more threatening. Wind gusts were increasing, and she could see the dark wall of the approaching front moving across the desert like a tsunami of bad weather. "Viper lead requesting weather update," she transmitted. Jake's response crackled through increasing static. "Viper 4, weather's manageable. Maintain formation and continue mission." But manageable was clearly a relative term. The wind was now gusting to 40 knots, creating turbulence that made precise formation flying increasingly difficult. Evelyn noticed that her aircraft's response to control inputs was becoming sluggish, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the flight control systems were struggling to compensate for the atmospheric conditions. "Viper flight, heads up. I'm showing intermittent navigation errors. Recommend cross-checking positions using backup systems." "Viper 4, maintain position and stop cluttering the frequency with minor technical issues." Jake's voice carried an edge of irritation. "We've got a mission to complete." Lieutenant Foster's voice joined the conversation. "Viper 2 also showing some nav display fluctuation. All aircraft, trust your primary systems and maintain mission focus. Minor electronic issues are normal in these weather conditions." But normal was exactly what this wasn't. Evelyn watched her displays with growing concern as the navigation errors became more frequent and pronounced. Her artificial horizon occasionally flickered, her fuel flow indicators showed momentary spikes, and her radio was picking up increasing interference. The pattern Ortega had identified was manifesting exactly as she'd feared, marginal systems becoming unreliable under stress. "Viper 3, I'm having trouble maintaining precise formation." Sarah Kim's voice revealed the tension that everyone was feeling, but only she was willing to admit. "Viper 3, tighten it up. This is basic formation flying," Jake responded. But Evelyn could see Sarah's aircraft through the increasing turbulence, and the young pilot was doing everything right. The problem wasn't technique, it was that their aircraft systems were providing inconsistent information while operating in deteriorating weather conditions. Then, the situation went from concerning to dangerous in the space of 30 seconds. "Viper 2, I've lost GPS navigation," Foster's voice cracked with sudden alarm. "Viper lead, my flight controls are responding sluggishly," Sarah added, her professional composure beginning to fracture. Evelyn checked her own systems and saw the confirmation of her worst fears. Multiple aircraft experiencing simultaneous system degradations, exactly as the maintenance data had suggested was possible. "All aircraft, this is Viper 4. Recommend immediate return to base. We're experiencing coordinated system failures consistent with the telemetry issues identified this morning." "Negative, Viper 4. Jake's response was sharp and immediate. "These are minor malfunctions. Maintain mission and adapt to equipment variances." But adaptation had limits, and they were rapidly approaching those limits. The weather front had arrived ahead of schedule, bringing with it severe turbulence, reduced visibility, and wind conditions that made formation flying dangerous even with fully functional aircraft. "Viper 2, I can't maintain heading. My compass is spinning." Foster's transmission was filled with panic. "All aircraft, break formation and maintain individual navigation using backup instruments," Evelyn commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with a calm authority. "Viper 4, you're not the flight lead," Jake snapped back. "All aircraft, maintain formation and continue mission." But continuing the mission was no longer an option. Sarah's aircraft suddenly dropped out of formation, her flight controls apparently not responding to her inputs. Foster was wandering off course, clearly disoriented by his instrument failures, and Jake's own aircraft was beginning to show the signs of the same system degradations that were affecting the rest of the flight. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Viper 3. I've lost primary flight controls." Sarah's aircraft was now in a shallow dive, her backup system struggling to maintain level flight. Through the static and interference, Evelyn could hear the fear in the young pilot's voice as she fought to regain control of her fighter. The moment had arrived when experience mattered more than ego, when the difference between veteran wisdom and youthful confidence could be measured in lives saved or lost. "All aircraft, this is Viper 4. I'm assuming tactical command of this flight." Evelyn's voice cut through the radio chaos with the unmistakable authority of someone who had faced real emergencies and survived them. There was no discussion, no debate, just the calm assumption of leadership when leadership was desperately needed. "Viper lead, shut up and listen." Evelyn interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of steel that brooked no argument. Viper 3, confirm your backup attitude indicator is functional. Viper 3, yes ma'am, backup AI is working. Sarah responded immediately, her voice steadying as someone finally took control of the deteriorating situation. Good. Disconnect your autopilot completely and fly manual inputs only. Use your backup compass and maintain heading 270. Do not trust any electronic navigation displays. While Sarah struggled to comply with the instructions, Evelyn quickly assessed the tactical situation. 4 aircraft with compromised systems, rapidly deteriorating weather, and a flight lead who was more concerned with maintaining authority than ensuring survival. Viper 2, what's your fuel state? Viper 2 showing 30 minutes remaining, but my fuel flow indicator is fluctuating wildly. Foster's aircraft was clearly experiencing the same systematic failures as the others, but his panic was making the situation worse. Evelyn had seen this before. Young pilots who had never faced real emergencies, paralyzed by the gap between their training scenarios and actual crisis. Viper 2, ignore your electronic displays. Calculate fuel remaining based on mission time and known consumption rates. You have sufficient fuel for return to base if we head back immediately. But the mission, Jake interjected. The mission is over, Captain. Right now, the mission is getting everyone home alive. Evelyn switched to manual flight controls, feeling the immediate difference as her aircraft responded directly to her inputs without the electronic interpretation that had been causing the erratic behavior. It was a skill she'd maintained through thousands of hours of practice, but one that the younger pilots had largely abandoned in favor of computer-assisted flight. All aircraft, switch to manual flight controls, use backup instruments only. We're going to navigate home using compass headings and visual references. But that's impossible in these weather conditions. No, Lieutenant, it's just difficult, and difficult is what we're trained for. Through the increasing turbulence and reduced visibility, Evelyn began the methodical process of manually flying her aircraft while simultaneously coordinating the emergency recovery of 3 other fighters whose pilots were struggling with skills they'd never been required to master. Viper 3, maintain 1-mile spacing and follow my heading changes. Don't anticipate, just respond to my actual movements. Sarah's aircraft was flying more steadily now, the young pilot adapting quickly to manual flight once someone had given her clear, achievable instructions. Viper 2, stop fixating on your instruments. Look outside. Maintain visual contact with Viper 3 and fly formation based on aircraft position, not electronic displays. But I can't see the runway from here.
You don't need to see the runway yet, Foster. You need to see Sarah's aircraft and maintain position relative to her. Navigation is my job right now. Evelyn was calculating their position using techniques she'd learned decades ago and practiced religiously, despite the mockery of younger pilots who considered such skills obsolete. Wind drift, compass bearing, time and distance calculations, visual checkpoint identification, all the fundamental skills that modern pilots dismissed as unnecessary in an age of GPS and automated systems. Viper Lead, what's your status? She asked, finally acknowledging Jake's presence. I'm having some control difficulties, he admitted reluctantly. Understood. Switch to manual flight and follow standard procedures. No heroics, no complex maneuvers, just basic flying. The admission that Jake was struggling with the same problems as everyone else seemed to deflate his resistance to Evelyn's leadership. For the first time since the crisis began, he stopped arguing and started following instructions. All aircraft, we're 15 minutes from base. Weather is clearing to the south, so we'll approach from that direction. Landing will be individual, straight-in approaches, no formation work. Through the static and interference, Evelyn heard the AWACS controller trying to re-establish contact. AWACS, Viper 4. We have 4 aircraft with multiple system failures returning to base under manual flight control. Request straight-in approach, runway 27, emergency equipment standing by. Roger, Viper 4. You're cleared for approach. Emergency equipment is responding. As they broke through the worst of the weather and the airfield became visible in the distance, Evelyn felt the familiar mixture of relief and satisfaction that came with bringing everyone home safely.
It wasn't the kind of victory that would be celebrated in the officers' club, but it was the kind that mattered most. The quiet triumph of experience over emergency, of skill over systems, of wisdom over ego. All aircraft, Viper 4. Nice job, everyone. Let's get these birds on the ground. One by one, they landed safely. Sarah with a slightly hard touchdown, but perfect directional control. Foster with visible relief as his wheels touched concrete. Jake with uncharacteristic humility, and finally Evelyn herself, her aircraft touching down exactly where it was supposed to, with the precision that comes from decades of practice. As they taxied back to the parking area, Evelyn saw the emergency vehicles and the crowd of ground personnel who had assembled to witness their return. Among them was Sergeant Ortega, who gave her a small thumbs up that said everything about vindication, validation, and the quiet satisfaction of being proven right when being right mattered most. The silence that followed engine shutdown was profound. Not the comfortable quiet of a successful mission, but the heavy stillness that comes after disaster narrowly avoided. Evelyn sat in her cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the stick, feeling the tremor in her muscles that always followed high-stress flying. Around the flight line, emergency vehicles stood ready, their red lights painting the concrete in urgent pulses. She climbed down from her aircraft slowly, methodically, completing her post-flight checklist, even though every system would need extensive inspection before the plane flew again. Habit and discipline had gotten them home safely. Abandoning either now would dishonor what they'd just survived. "Major Carter," the young airman approached with obvious relief. "Are you injured, ma'am?" "No, airman. All pilots are uninjured." She handed her her helmet and survival gear, but these aircraft are grounded pending full systems analysis. Across the tarmac, she could see the other pilots emerging from their cockpits with varying degrees of composure. Sarah climbed down with obvious shakiness but maintained her bearing, already talking to her crew chief about the control issues she'd experienced. Foster sat on his wing root, head in his hands, the reality of how close they had come to disaster finally settling in. Jake was different. Instead of relief or gratitude, his body language radiated anger and humiliation. He yanked off his helmet with sharp, jerky movements and stalked toward the operations building without speaking to anyone, not his crew chief, not the emergency personnel, and certainly not Evelyn. "Ma'am." Sergeant Ortega appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with concern and something that might have been vindication. "Heard you had some excitement up there." "The telemetry issues manifested exactly as you predicted, Sergeant. Multiple aircraft, simultaneous system degradations under stress conditions." He nodded grimly. "I've already started pulling maintenance logs for the investigation. Every warning sign, every anomaly we documented, it's all there in black and white." "Good. Make sure everything's properly documented and preserved. This incident is going to generate some questions." As if summoned by her words, Colonel Hayes emerged from the operations building, his expression grim. He approached their small group with the careful steps of a man navigating a minefield.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.